Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rutgers Graduate School of Education's Summer Series for Educators on Equity and Excellence in Remote Learning. Before I describe tonight's session, I want to say a little bit about on equity and excellence in remote learning. Before I describe tonight's session, I want to say a little bit about on equity and excellence in remote learning. Before I describe tonight's session, I want to say a bit about the series and the people behind it. All aspects of this series, from the selection of topics to the content of the 5 sessions, were designed collaboratively by a diverse steering committee that includes teachers, educators, school leaders, parents, community members, graduate students, and scholars, most of whom experienced firsthand the shift to remote learning this past March. Look, no one is an expert on how to provide engaging, meaningful instruction during a pandemic. Our belief is that by bringing together people with diverse experiences and perspectives, we can provide some useful approaches and better support students during this challenging time. Our selection of topics reflects our commitment to equity at a time when inequalities are being exacerbated by the pandemic and resulting economic crisis. Tonight's session, our third, focuses on supporting emerging bilingual students in the remote classroom. We use the term emerging bilinguals because it captures the positive goal of becoming bilingual rather than leaving one's home language behind. As you watch, please participate in the YouTube chat. We'll be taking questions there, and it's also a really good place for you to share your experiences and insights as we go. If you don't see the chat, then just refresh your screen and it should appear. Our moderator for this evening is Marina Feldman. She's a doctoral student and teaching assistant at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education, and she conducts research on early childhood education in Brazil and in the United States, and with Latinx communities in New Jersey. Marina will introduce our panel and our discussants. Handing it over to you now, Marina.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you here with us so we can think together about ways to support emerging bilinguals in the remote classroom. I hope we all learn new strategies tonight, but also that we all remind ourselves that the linguistic and cultural backgrounds of each and every one of our students is a valuable asset. This idea is very dear to my heart and also very important to the goal we share here at the GSE of advancing equity and excellence in education. So I'm very honored to be here and to introduce our amazing team of presenters for tonight. Genevieve Langen is an ESL teacher at Bridgewater Raritan School District, where she works in an elementary co-teaching setting. She has a bachelor's degree in Spanish from Rutgers University and a master's degree in teaching English as a second language from the College of New Jersey. Melissa, or Mel Katz, is a push-in ESL teacher in the New Brunswick Public Schools, where she works with students from 5th to 8th grade. She graduated from the College of New Jersey in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in elementary education and a master's degree in urban education with a K-12 ESL specialization. Brian Benavides is a bilingual language arts teacher at Hunterdon Central Regional High School. He has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in curriculum and learning, with a concentration in bilingual and ESL education. He has taught in the elementary, middle, and high school levels. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your ideas and strategies with us tonight. We will hear from each of our presenters in a couple of minutes, and after that, we'll have a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, you can post it to our chat, as Beth mentioned, and we'll try to answer them in the quick Q&A portion. After that, we'll hear from our discussants, who I'm also very honored to introduce. Laura Arredondo is the supervisor of word languages and ELL programs at Hunterdon Central Regional High School. She has worked for over 25 years in New Jersey public schools, including 20 years as a bilingual, ESL, and Spanish teacher at elementary, middle, and high school levels in both urban and suburban settings. Mary Curran is professor of practice in language education at Rutgers GSE, where she directs the Office of Local Global Partnerships. Thank you so much, Mary and Laura, for being here with us tonight. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve, who will share ideas for creating a collaborative community for emerging bilingual students. Genevieve?
Hi, my name is Genevieve Langen, and I'm an elementary ESL teacher for the Bridgewater Raritan School District. I teach in a co-teaching setting using sheltered instruction, which means that I work in a general education classroom alongside the general education teacher, and we work together to create lessons with content and language objectives and implement strategies and supports to help the emerging bilingual students in that classroom. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can create a collaborative community for emerging bilingual students, but this also applies for all students. On the next slide, I'm just going to talk about the 3 different things that I think that we can do to help collaboration in online settings. So the first being establishing connections and how we can build relationships in an online setting. The second being promoting discussions and how we can provide and support continued language use opportunities for our emerging bilinguals. And third, how we can focus on our students' strengths and engage and empower these students in these new learning environments. On the third slide, I'm going to talk about how we can establish connections. So I know that I personally feel a lot of pressure to kind of move rapidly through the curriculum with shortened times and virtual meetings, but it's very important to slow down. And my co-teacher and I began each virtual meet with some type of social emotional connection. So that may look different depending on your students, their needs, and their ages, but setting aside this time and providing opportunity for student conversation helps build relationships from teacher to student and with the classmates themselves. So you can align these conversations to language and content objectives and work as a community to establish expectations and routines for conversation, but this is the basis of building a collaborative community. Transitioning from these conversations, we can also work to promote academic discussions. So on the next slide, I talk about how we can promote academic discussions in our virtual classrooms. So having students take on a leadership role in establishing the expectations, rules, and guidelines for these discussions. So creating a dialogue where the students can talk about the similarities and differences between discussions in the physical classroom and what it looks like online and through written threads as well. On the next slide, I'm going to show different ways that we can enhance these academic discussions. So the first being using screen sharing to enhance discussions. As teachers, we use screen sharing with our students and colleagues. Well, students can use screen sharing to enhance these discussions and provide visuals as well, which is very important for emerging bilinguals. As well, the continued use of home languages. In the physical classroom, we have this fluid language use where we're encouraging students to use their home language to build on what they know and access the content. We should continue to encourage our students to use their home language to increase accessibility to the discussion and content. And also, we should create resources to support student language that are tailored to the students and their language proficiency levels. So we should mix up both auditory and written resources. I work with young students in 2nd grade, so making these resources very accessible is important too. So embedding videos into the assignment, into the doc or slides, putting vocabulary cards and word banks right there for students to access. On the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about student screen sharing. This was something that I came across accidentally. I was teaching a virtual meet and one of my students started sharing his screen, and my initial reaction was kind of like, oh no. But later in the meet, another little girl needed help finding an assignment. So I asked that student, would you like to share your screen and show her how to get there? And from that point on, screen sharing was a part of all of our virtual meets. So it's a very valuable tool. It can be used on the spot to answer questions. It can also be used for vocabulary development. In a lot of instances, we had children saying, oh, you know the thing next to the thing. Can you present your screen? And then the classmates and peers can provide vocabulary input and help with the vocabulary input of that student, and acquisition of that student, as well as all of the other students. And another idea is that you can also create lessons that work with screen sharing specifically. So an example being in the physical classroom, we had partners work together to revise and edit each other's stories. And online, a student can screen share his or her story and can hold a small group discussion to provide verbal feedback. And one of the concerns that I initially had, and I think maybe other teachers would have, is how can we keep this as a tool and not a toy, and kind of just involving students in this process much as we would in the classroom, with helping them become part of the community to establish rules, expectations, and a way in which a student can indicate or ask that they would like to screen share. One way that I like to do this is to use storytelling or scenarios. So for example, saying, the other day I was sharing a story in which I had written with my friend on a Google Meet. When I was presenting my story and reading it, she started presenting over my screen. And then asking the students, how do you think that made me feel? How would you respond? To help guide them into creating these rules and expectations. We want them to be digital citizens and to be safe, but we want them to be collaborative too. So on the next slide, I want also to keep in mind being flexible with discussions. So how one student participates in a discussion may look differently to other students. This is a very difficult time, so we need to be flexible and open for students that may not be able to attend a meet. But we also want to ensure that they are part of this collaborative community. So if they are unable to physically attend a meet, we need to provide opportunities for them to create video, audio recordings, reply to written threads in an ongoing manner so that they feel they're a valued member of this collaborative community, but also the students that are attending the meet see them as a valued member of this community as well. So providing opportunities for them to respond back. And not only keeping this flexibility in mind for students who can attend a meet, but also for students who are at an entering language proficiency level or are timid or anxious and other circumstances that we really need to be aware and responsive to. So tapping into these student strengths and making sure that they're valued members of this collaborative community. On the next slide, I just want to point out the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is focusing on student strengths. I know that in the physical classroom, we're constantly using our students' strengths and interests to develop lessons and instruction. It can be a little more difficult virtually, but we just have to be open-minded. And much as when that student had started presenting his screen, just kind of looking at those instances and acting on them to look at that as a strength, and how can you use that student's strength to develop your instruction and technology use as well. And another way that I do this is by continually asking for feedback from students. Did you like using these resources? Were they helpful? Did you enjoy the assignment? And kind of hearing their responses and filtering through those strengths and interests. On the next slide, I just want to point out that a lot of times virtual learning can seem very teacher-led and teacher-directed, but it absolutely can be a student-directed type of learning experience, and we can let students take the lead by giving them opportunities to share different strategies, technology, solve problems, and talk with one another in discussions, and provide as much opportunity for student choice as possible and letting them direct the instruction, taking into consideration their strengths and interests. What are they doing at home? How can this be worked into the curriculum and content and language objectives so that we can keep them interested, keep them engaged in online learning, and looking forward to coming back each day to virtual meets. And then on the last slide, I would just like to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I feel very thankful to be part of such a collaborative educational community.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, for getting us to a great start and also getting us thinking about this very important piece of the puzzle, which is collaboration and building community. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Mel, who will also give us insight on that, but thinking more about how teachers can collaborate. Mel?
Hi, thank you so much. So my name is Melissa Katz. I go by Mel. As was said, I'm an ESL teacher for grades 5 to 8. And what's different about my setting is I'm a push-in teacher. So what that means is that I go into about 6 or 7 classrooms a day. So collaboration is really essential to servicing our emergent bilingual students. So on the next slide, Thank you. You'll see I just put a little background on kind of the essentials of collaboration, really just noting that this is important in all environments, whether there's a push-in ESL teacher, it's pull-out ESL, sheltered instruction, bilingual classes, right? Anytime that there's sharing of students, it's really important that adults are communicating with one another around the students. And the big thing now is that as we shift to virtual and/or hybrid instruction, this is really an opportunity to rethink the ways that we collaborate with one another. Oftentimes in a traditional school setting, we run into barriers such as schedules and things that make it difficult to be able to meet with one another. So shifting to online and hybrid offers some opportunities for us as staff members to think about how can we collaborate in new ways using the technology that's available to us. So on the next slide, I'll just go over some sample collaboration principles and protocols. These are ones that I found really helpful in my practices. So the first one was choosing a method of communication. Whoever you work with, it's really important to be consistent with each other. So as partners, if you're partner teachers or if you work with lots of other educators, picking one method of communication that works for everyone and staying consistent to that, so that if you know that you have to reach out to someone or you're looking for something from them, you know where to go. It could be email, text, call, Zoom meetings, a group chat, whatever the collective decides on. The second point is to invite one another to all meetings. I always say that I would rather say no to a meeting and, no, it's okay, I don't really need to be there, but thank you for offering, than to have missed something and feel like I have to scramble for that information, right? So this is formal and informal meetings, and it's really important that ESL and bilingual teachers advocate for joining like content area meetings, and that those who run them are also inviting in those teachers. And the last point is that it's not a competition for students' attention and work. And this is something I really had to grapple with, that students are navigating new technologies, they're learning a new language on top of that, and that the focus should be on their learning and achievement. And that should really ground the collaboration between educators. So on the next slide, you'll see the first of three kind of practices that I found really useful. So the first one is sharing plans and student materials. You'll see here, I just put a screenshot of my Google Drive and the blurred out list, just to respect their privacy, of educators who I shared it with. And these are all classroom teachers that I work with. And you may be thinking to yourself, like, Mel, you're telling me to share my Google Drive. Like, is that really that essential? And I want to say yes, right? This may seem really simple, but it's actually incredibly important to share these materials. In a push-in setting, this gives the ESL teacher or anyone else who is servicing emergent bilinguals the ability to see the materials ahead of time, make modifications and accommodations, and provide supplemental materials to students in planning our instruction. And in a pull-out setting, or where it may be a bilingual class, both teachers can see what each other is working on, right? And then they are able to communicate that to students, right? If I know what students are working on and they come to me with a question for one of their other classes, I'm easily able to go in whatever platform it may be, say Google Classroom, see what it is, look at the work in the Google Drive, and then explain it to the student, rather than trying to reroute them to other adults and through routes of communication. And that this is a great way to know what students are being given so as not to overwhelm them with assignments. On the next slide, to the point about collaborating through platforms, in our district, we use Google Classroom. And something really important to me was inviting anyone and everyone who worked with the students that I worked with into my classroom. So even if I didn't push into their classes, I pretty much push into language arts classes. I still invited the math teachers, right? Because we're departmentalized. They teach ELA and social studies, and then math and science. So the point on the bottom, right? You don't have to work directly with an educator to still invite them so they can see what's happening. The most important thing here is to develop shared protocols and practices for posting collaboratively, right? I know there can be some hesitation around welcoming people into a Google Classroom or any other platform, especially because we're navigating these new environments. Have a discussion with one another. Say, this is the time we'd like to post. This is how I'd like to post. This is fine, for someone to go in and add more materials to a student's work. So really just working together and deciding from the beginning what is the best way to post assignments and communicate with students. And another great option with this is that for me, I was a part of the whole classroom, but I could go in and I could add supplemental materials, make modifications for just my students because I was in the classroom and had access to their work. The thing that I found most helpful is actually on the next slide. I have to give a big shout out to two of the teachers I worked with, Maria Rosasco and Kimberly Sinatra, in creating this collaboration form. So this is a Google form. We were all kind of had our own, and then Maria said to us, let's just have one where we all work together. And you'll see that on the bottom, I took a screenshot of all the different classes with the different students. So our classes were split into different teams because we're departmentalized. Down one column, we would have a list of all the student names, and then we would mark our assignments as complete, in progress, not yet started, or excused. It's important to note that this was not meant to be punitive for students. This was strictly providing data to us. So we could look at patterns, right? If the student is completing all of their math work, but not their language arts work or ESL work, perhaps we need to communicate with the student and provide more support. If they're completing all their assignments, that's great. What more can we do to them? And if we're seeing that students aren't completing assignments, how can we reach out to their families and caregivers? So this is one form shared amongst all educators who see a student. And it's great. You can invite anyone to it, and everyone has their own tab to add things. On the next slide, I just want to share this great tool, which is Talking Points. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's a caregiver educator communication platform. What's great is that it has automatic translation, but it does not require the families to have an app on their phone or device. So there is a parent app that they can download, but if they aren't able to download it like other platforms require, it will go right to their phone as a text message. You can send a whole class message and it'll send it to the individual families and caregivers. It auto translates, and what's great is you can also see the original message in either English, Spanish, or whatever language you're using, which is great because sometimes if we make a typing error, the translation may be a little off, and you can kind of play around by looking at the original message. So on the next slide, I just share one example of what it looked like to collaboratively lesson plan in a middle school setting. The assignment was basically reading a chapter in our whole class novel and answering comprehension questions, focusing on character and plot development. So the mainstream teacher set the pacing for the novel, the chapter, and the days they would be reading, created the comprehension questions focused on the target language arts standards, and then provided the students with the resources. All of our students have audio and PDF. So then jumping over to the role of an ESL teacher, what I would do is I would provide my students a summary of the chapter in simplified English. I would scaffold the questions such as rewording or providing differentiated sentence starters, and then record a video of myself typing a sample response as a model. And then going back to the point before, I could go right into Google Classroom and add those specifically to just the students who I worked with in that class, which was really great. So on the next slide, I just summarize some of the main points, which is obviously to stay focused on the students. If students aren't completing certain assignments, it's not personal. We have to strictly take that as data to figure out what we need to do as educators to support clearer communications. Making mistakes is expected, right? This is new, and we have to respect and honor students when they communicate with us that something isn't working. And they may be doing that. Their method of communication may simply be not completing the work, right? That's something for us to know. And to ask one another for help. The great thing about collaboration and partnerships is that we all come to this with an area of expertise and can learn from one another in a time where so much in education is changing. And on the next slide is again just a thank you, my email if anyone would like to contact me, as well as my Twitter account. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join everyone in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mel. It's been really interesting to listen to so many practical tips to think about collaboration from both you and Genevieve. And we're going to jump in a little more into instruction in a second with our next presenter. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Mel, Genevieve, or Brian, who's coming next, you can post it to the chat and we'll try to address it in the Q&A session. But now let's hear from our last speaker tonight. Brian is going to share his insights and a sample lesson from his work with bilingual language arts. Brian?
Oh, thank you for having me. As was said in the introduction, I teach a bilingual language arts class at Huntington Central. Our main focus in my class is to build the students' literacy skills in their first language, which in this case, that language is Spanish. And so I'm happy to share some tips that I use in order to get through the remote instruction these past few months. So on the next slide, I have 3 characteristics that I focused on when building my lessons. It wasn't necessarily too different from what I was doing throughout the year. I just had to modify a little bit for online. And these characteristics are accessibility. And by that, I really meant when you choose your method for sharing your assignments with students and communication, as Mel mentioned before, making sure to stick to the one app or platform that you decided to work on, because it gets a little confusing for students if you don't have a centralized location for the materials, for assignments, and for any announcements that you have to make. Another one was flexibility, making sure that whatever assignments you give students, they're able to complete it in a variety of ways, be that audio, video, they can draw something or write something down and send you a picture. And so that was very important for me as well, that they could do it on their phone, iPad, laptop. You know, you have to think these things ahead. And it was very helpful to do that for the students. Another one was making sure that students were always participating, allowing students to engage with myself and other classmates. And so these were really the things I was thinking about as I planned the lesson. So on my next slide, I have a list, a short list. As I said before, I like to keep the usage of apps and platforms to a minimum so that it's easier for students. The main one that I used was Pear Deck, which was an online interactive slide presentation for lessons, and students are able to engage with those slides through drawings, through writing, through a variety of ways, speaking. And what's really nice about it is that students are able to see what their classmates are responding and what they're saying. Google Classroom was very awesome because it integrated with Google Suite, which allowed me to put Google Docs up, Google Slides, Google Sheets, and even the Google Meets. And so I highly recommend Google Classroom. The trick of Google Classroom is making sure you organize it in a way that students can, you know, because of the way the assignments come up, it's almost like a stream, like on Twitter, if you use Twitter or Facebook. So being mindful of the organization of your Google Classroom. Google Meet was my preferred platform because it integrated with Google Classroom, and my students currently use Gmail. The school gives them a Gmail account, so I highly recommend Google Meet. The only thing with Google Meet, and I saw a question earlier about this, is that it doesn't allow you the same functionality as Zoom, like muting students or removing a student from the chat sometimes, but I never had any problems having to do that. So I highly recommend Google Meet for that reason. And you can screen share in Google Meet or Zoom, which is fantastic. And Google Suite, as you know, is just the variety of apps that Google gives you, that they could be, you know, Google Docs, Google Sheets, and slides, as I mentioned before. So the next slide is just a basic rundown of the lesson that I worked on with my students. In our unit was conflict resolution. And so I really just wanted students to cite specific evidence, whether in writing or speaking, from an image that's related to conflict resolution, and just having the students think about the image. So just your typical outline, anticipatory set, a writing prompt question, they analyze a photo, we had a discussion on the photograph, introduction of the text, and a picture walk and discussion as well. So on the next slide, I just have like the image. Oh, so I'm sorry, let me go back one. So this is just the opening question, the prompt, which is how would you define conflict? And so the next slide is just essentially, as you see there, students can write their response. And so this is where on Google, you can set it up on Google Slides and you can put it through Pear Deck, which allows you to have the interaction through that app. The next slide is just the image I used for the students. And the way I actually make this a little bit more engaging is that I break up the image in 4 parts, and students take notes on each part of the photograph before I show them the whole image. And so they can do that in writing, they can do that through Pear Deck, whatever works best for you. And the next slide is a stock image I have of Pear Deck because I couldn't block out the names of my students from my Pear Deck. So this is essentially how it looks when you're on Pear Deck. Students can see the responses and you can present those responses to the students, but the students wouldn't see the names of their classmates, which I actually kind of like. If you have students who are in your class at the moment, they can share right out and say that whose response it was. But I've noticed a lot of my kids like to leave the anonymity of Pear Deck as is, which is a lot of fun because it creates new discussions. The next slide is just the book, really. Just like how I said, I present the book to the students and I have them look through the pages of the book through a PDF. I send them a PDF on Google Classroom and I have them find what page stood out to you, what image in the book stood out to you, and why was it so interesting, what stood out about it. And they all get to talk about why. And sometimes they'll highlight a subtitle of the book saying, I really like this chapter and this chapter's title is this, and I think that it might be about this. So my students really like to do that, and they're high schoolers. So, I'm really surprised that they really love it that much, but they do. And so I try to incorporate that as much as I can. The next slide, I just have some basic tips, allowing students to participate via audio or text discussion. And of course, the Pear Deck has responses that are live, which is fantastic. You can, making sure you streamline and limit app use. It gets very confusing if you try to use a plethora of apps. Less is more when it comes to remote instruction, especially if you want assignments to be turned in a timely fashion. Showing your face, I think, has been very important, and my students, I've realized, really enjoy when they actually get to see your face. One day I just had my camera off. I didn't really like that, so they made sure. I made sure after that to always show my face for my students. Keeping lectures short. It is remote instruction, so my lectures would range anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, no more than that. And making sure it's always high engagement. You stop and go and you gauge how your students are doing. Next slide just has some basic resources, but are actually more life-saving than I thought they would be. PDF Escape allowed me to edit a lot of the PDFs that I had to share with my students. PDF Merger, believe it or not, it is great when you can just merge. If you have many PDFs that you have to share with students, putting it all into one file for students is the best you can do. Everything is about streamlining. Pear Deck, of course, Canva, if you have to design an infographic for a lesson, or have students design an infographic for you to convey an idea that you might be trying to get at with them. Slides Go, if you need to create presentation slides, great templates on there. Screencastify is also something I use often to record my screen for students who are not able to attend at the time that I'm logged on. And that way you give access to those students as well who are not able to engage with you at the time that you're on. The next slide is just my contact info, and this is my school email and also my Twitter if you'd like to engage on Twitter. And I'm here to help you in any way you need, and I hope you find some information there that may help you in your instruction.
Thank you so much, Brian. I already saved some of the tools you provided to use later. And thank you all so much for your insight. It was lovely to hear from each of you, your different perspectives, and also the strategies you've used with the different ages and different classroom settings you work in. Now we have some interesting questions from our audience to continue our conversation. I'm going to bundle together a couple of questions about apps and tools, and maybe each of you can share some tips if you still have any. So I think Brian already mentioned that Google Meet can have student screen share, which was one of the questions. Folks were also asking about an app or website you recommend to have students share video or audio recordings. And someone in the chat also mentioned Flipgrid for videos, but was not sure about something specifically for audio. And also There's a question about what platform you like best between Zoom and Google Meet, which Brian, I think already replied to that question. But if you had any other comments regarding the apps and tools that you all use, maybe we can start with Mel.
Sure. So I was super glad to hear Flipgrid mentioned. That was really important for my students. It's great for audio as well. I know that video tends to get emphasized because they have all these really cool video tools, but I also had a lot of students who just weren't comfortable recording videos, which is completely fine, right? It's the same around, you know, our wanting to create equitable access when we think about student videos on Google Meets or things, right? Not forcing students to have their videos on. So I would tell my students, you know, you don't have to have your video on when you're recording. You can type something in there on the screen in Flipgrid. You could just leave it as a blackboard or a whiteboard, put a fun sticker emoji, and the students would record audio. Another thing that I like to use with students, so Screencastify was really great as an educator. I know Brian mentioned it, to be able to record lessons, post it for students. It's how I post anytime I would do an example of writing something for students. I would screen record myself writing it and then post it for them. Screencastify also has a student submit site. So it's still being tested out there in their beta version, but you can sign up for free, and basically it creates an assignment link for students and they can submit an audio file. So those were kind of the two main tools focused on students submitting audio.
Great, thank you so much. Before I turn it over to Brian, I also want to add that someone was asking specifically about Peer Deck and if it can be used for a synchronous assignment. Because this person was using Nearpod and considering to switch, but wasn't sure if the other option also allowed for a synchronous assignment. So Brian, do you want to jump in?
Yes, so the question that I saw here was how to organize the Google Classroom. It's kind of difficult to explain it without sharing a screenshot, but I'm going to do my very best here. What I do for the Google Classroom, once I'm on Google Classroom, you can create, when you create your assignment, you can actually create a topic. And when you create that topic, all of the assignments that you post under that topic is going to appear only under that topic. So what I do is, for example, if I have a do now, I'll just create a very stock topic, which is kind of like, you know, the title of the Google Classroom. And my do now will always be at the very top and will only show up under that title. Then if whatever the unit name is, I'll create another topic. And let's say if my unit is conflict resolution. So now all my assignments will appear under that topic. So if, for example, the do now, I delete it every day. That way, just you'll have a long list, like 20 do nows, and it just gets overwhelming and students will have to start to scroll down to find the day's assignments. So that's what I do. So I keep the do nows just one a day, delete it by the end of the day so that students who can't come in at the time that I post it are able to do it throughout the day. And the unit assignments, that does turn to a longer list, but that's much easier to find. So that's really the way I have been organizing my Google Classroom, keeping the topics that way and making sure I post all my assignments under the topics. That's been very helpful for me.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve also on the apps and tools that you use, but also I think you could probably answer this question. Is it possible to do breakout rooms in Google Meets? Genevieve.
So I use Flipgrid too and Screencastify. So those are apps that I'm also using, but particularly working with younger students, and kind of what Brian was saying is that less is more, especially with younger students, and keeping things as simple as possible. A lot of my students were familiar with using the iPad in the classroom, or some of them have iPads at home, so they could just record their audio and video on their iPads or use their mom or dad's phone, and they were able to email me just a recording using any type of audio or video recording on any type of device. And in terms of Google Meet using breakout rooms, I don't think it's an option yet, but what I would do is my co-teacher and I would meet with the whole class at the beginning in one Google Meet, and then I would open up a separate Google Meet and copy the link and then post it into the chat. And my group would click on the link, exit out of the other Google Meet, and would join my group. And they were in second grade, and that was pretty easy for all of them to do.
Great, thank you, Genevieve. I'm gonna ask a question that was made specifically for Mel. So first, what form do you provide the summaries, sentence starters, and other modifications to students in the remote learning setting? Someone shared that they've been using text summarization online website. And also, I just wanted to remind everyone, because some people asked to see Melissa's slides, and we're going to be sharing resources on the GSE link that has all the material from the remote learning sessions. And people are also asking to have access to the template of your chart, Mel, if you'd be willing to share. But let's go back to the question about how do you provide summaries, sentence starters, and modifications.
Thank you. So that really goes back to that collaboration piece of being in the Google Classrooms. So this year in 8th grade specifically, which was the example lesson I shared, I only had one student in ESL in 8th grade. So I was a part of the Google Classroom, and what I would do is, oh, I'm sorry, my Apple Watch got a little excited, is the mainstream teacher would send me the assignments ahead of time through Google Drive, so that I was able to see kind of what the pacing was, the chapters they would be reading, and be able to do my front end work of writing a summary. There are summarizing websites. I preferred to do it myself just because I knew the student so well. And kind of what he needed in terms of a summary. And then what I would do is, once the teacher posted the assignment, I would go directly into the document. It was posted in a Google Doc. I would go directly into the doc and then copy and paste it, which goes back to that idea of really simplifying and streamlining things, right? So the student could open the document and would have everything there. They would first read the chapter and then would open it to the summary. The modified question would be right in there, so the student wouldn't even realize that the question was changed, right? So it was in there. The core of the question was still the same. It was just changing some of the academic language in it. And then the sentence starters would be in there as well, so that the student could type directly into the document. But because I was a co-teacher in the classroom, I had direct access to the student work and could just directly modify the document. And then for anything that was screen recorded, I could simply edit the assignment for that one specific student and add additional resources.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question for Brian, and then a question that I also would like to hear insights from other people as well. So someone mentioned that they noticed your lessons were geared towards Spanish, and they asked if all of your students are native Spanish speakers or if you have a variety of languages. And then someone said, I teach ESL biology and my classroom is a large mix of languages. Should I be translating all of my work for all the languages present? And that's a topic that perhaps other presenters and maybe some of our discussants could add to. So
So to answer the first question, it is geared towards Spanish. So the best way to describe my class, it's pretty much English language arts, but in Spanish. But we do transition to English at some point in the year, usually halfway through the year. So all my students are native Spanish speakers. So that's pretty much a short answer to that. But with English, you just pretty much reduce the lexile and you can get students to really engage with your lesson. And yeah, that's pretty much my short answer.
I work with Brian. I'm very fortunate to work with Brian in Hunterdon Central, and Brian's class is bilingual language arts. The purpose of the class is for students to work on literacy in their native language, which is transferable to English. Most of our population is Spanish speaking, but we do have speakers of other languages. And in the content area sections, we do have, for example, an ELL bio class that has speakers of other languages, Gujarati, Arabic, Mandarin. And the teacher does not speak Spanish, and there is an ESL co-teacher in that class or a para. And in that case, the teacher must scaffold the English language, just as Brian said, use visual supports, reduce the lexile level. And the role of the ESL teacher could be supporting students using another resource, like an online translator or a dictionary when they need it. But that kind of translation is more student-driven. In that setting, the instruction does happen in English.
Thank you, Laura. Does any of the other presenters would like to add to this question about translation?
So something my supervisor Laura always taught me is that the trick there is making sure you, of course you could translate, and that really comes down to the district, but you really want to get down to finding authentic text in the language that you need it in, because that requires a separate degree than what we as educators have in order to do that. And also you need text that really speaks to the students that you're teaching. And I think translating, you'll never sleep if you get bogged down in translating all the text and assignments that you need for students. So if you could avoid translating, do so, but I know that's a challenge for certain districts, definitely.
Well, I think there are districts that would have a bilingual biology class in which you would look for authentic text in the language of the students. But we don't have enough students to have bilingual content areas. So, I mean, there are very few teachers that would be able to translate into many languages. So you would probably be using a resource that you could just have the students use. So in a case where there's all these different languages spoken, it would be really difficult to find these resources. And as Brian said, be really time consuming on your part. So, yeah.
Thank you. Genevieve, maybe do you have any insights on translating material for your specific context and with elementary education?
Yeah, so a lot of times I have speakers of several different languages, and I'm not usually using translating that often myself. Even though I do speak some of the languages that my students are using, they are more frequently using the language amongst each other. And all of the children in my group are speakers of different languages, but they speak different languages. So for example, if two students are speaking Spanish, they're using that language to support their understanding of the content, but then another student who may speak a different language, we kind of have a discussion of how we can use our home language to help us understand this content, but then we also need to include everyone in our group, so we start kind of translating into English ourselves and them working together. So the students do kind of a lot of verbal translating, but I myself am not translating anything. I, again, use a lot of the strategies that the other speakers were talking about, visuals and simplified text to help scaffold their language.
Great, thank you. I'm just gonna ask quickly our last questions. Some people who are not ESL teachers or don't have ESL co-teacher are asking for more general tips to be used to help language learners, and also how to streamline the process or support mainstream teachers in modifying assignments themselves. And a short question is just if someone has an app that helps with quick on-the-spot translation needs. So maybe we could quickly hear from each of our presenters for our last question.
I mean, for translation, really the biggest one is Google Translate. But I haven't really needed to use it, so I can't speak to it too much since I get to speak in Spanish to my students. But Google Translate has really been helpful for working with the students. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
I also use Google Translate. I find that that's pretty accurate and that it helps with creating emails to parents, even not with just children.
And for for teachers who may not work with an ESL teacher, I would say kind of two things. If there is an ESL teacher in your building and you just don't work with them directly, definitely reach out. I know that I try to collaborate with as many teachers as possible, even if I don't work with them directly, to provide any resources that I have relative to their content area. And if not, there's definitely some resources which I think we could include online that are ways to look at the language levels of your students. And in New Jersey, we are a WIDA state, using the WIDA can-do descriptors. I really love them because it's very asset-based, and they talk based on student levels and then broken down in terms of different language domains, what students at that language level can do. And then looking at that to figure out, how do I plan instruction that would best build upon the assets that students are bringing in their home languages, in English, and just in their general linguistic abilities, right, in the classroom. So that's really a go-to tool for me, is to look at the can-do descriptors to kind of ask myself some reflective questions about, where students are in their language acquisition, whether or not there's an ESL teacher.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone. We could talk for much longer, but we're running out of time. But thank you for being here and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to our discussants, Dr. Mary Curran and Dr. Laura Arredondo.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Genevieve and Mel and Brian, for those informative and really helpful presentations. I'm just going to take a few minutes to highlight a few takeaways from the presentations tonight. And really what I'm going to do is give us some sort of ways of thinking about teaching emerging bilinguals. And so all three presenters spoke today about how important it is to take an asset-based or strength-based approach to teaching emerging bilinguals, what Luis Mull and his colleagues called a funds of knowledge approach. And the key is, as Genevieve mentioned, really working hard, even in a remote context, to get to know our students and their families and communities. When we do that work, then we're able to build on and sustain those strengths as valuable learning tools and create lessons like the one Brian showed us that really develop literacy skills built on student strengths. And also we want to make sure that even in the remote context, we're building strong relationships with parents and guardians who then are partners with us and sharing their strengths and resources with us as well. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that all three presenters spoke about employing a translanguaging perspective and pedagogy that centers our students' languages and cultures, and then allows them to be used as resources for learning. This is really interesting and different because we often, as language educators, center the target language and the target culture. And this translanguaging approach really allows us to put the students' linguistic and cultural practices at the center, and then use those as strengths. And then students are able to use all the linguistic repertoire available to them. That sort of helps with that translating question that came up before too, where the students can use all those strengths. So this means that we want to be really flexible with regard to language policy so that students can use all their linguistic repertoire. And importantly, if we look at these two perspectives of a strength-based approach or translanguaging pedagogy, it really means that then students are able to show up and the emergent bilinguals can bring their full identities, everything they've got with them, to the learning process. And we want their entire selves to be there. And I think in terms of collaboration, as Mel discussed, we really want to make sure that that the students, everything that they have can be put into practice. And when collaborating, we want to make sure that we share with peers the strength-based and translanguaging approach. So we can think about how to put that into practice as well. So I'm going to turn it now to you, Laura. I know you're planning to share your perspective as a district supervisor. Thank you.
I always forget to unmute myself. Yeah, it really is an honor to, I know how hard it is, and you people in the audience, I think that I tell my teachers all the time, there's no question, this is the most difficult job in the world. And in this setting, it's very difficult to maximize student engagement. And I think what I've stuck out to me with these presentations are that all three of these teachers basically talked about two really important factors in maximizing student engagement, and that is student agency and authentic learning. So student agency means giving students a voice and a choice in learning. And, you know, as Genevieve suggested, this could be as simple as incorporating a discussion about our current situation, about quarantine, about remote learning, involving them in setting the norms for the new learning settings. This gives them a voice. It respects their knowledge, as Mary mentioned, respects the knowledge that they have from an asset-based perspective, and really helps them become more engaged in the learning process. Another important part of student agency is providing linguistic agency when we talk about translanguaging and allowing them to choose what language they communicate in, whether it be among themselves or with a teacher who happens to understand their language, which isn't always the case. Brian also shared a lot of electronic tools that help amplify students' voices in the classroom in a remote format, which is really important. You know, as a school leader, and this could be for those of you who are coaches, other supervisors, or just teachers who take a leading role in this for this population of students when districts often don't have a subjects specialist among their administrative staff. But it's extremely important for leaders to advocate for their teachers, specifically the purchasing of tools for students and teachers, a range of tools so educators can choose those that they're comfortable with, to get the district to provide structured and compensated time for collaboration. Mel spoke a lot about the importance of collaboration, and a lot of that was on a voluntary basis. Well, I think that our district is reducing a little bit of the instruction time to provide more PLC time, which is really essential in this new setting for teachers. Also, in the beginning of the year, this is always important, specific training for teachers in co-teaching roles. We always want that as teachers, and it never seems to happen. Well, even more reason to provide that this year. And I think also the agency for students, it also goes for educators. As a leader, you have to be really open for creative solutions. One of my teachers suggested to me that I look into purchasing clear masks, because as language teachers, students need to see our mouths and communicate it. And I thought, oh, what a great idea. And then that teacher also reminded me how important it is for students to see their teacher smile. So I was so busy with my paperwork. I was like, oh my goodness, this is so important. So students themselves and teachers are just great problem solvers. So thank you all so much, people in the audience. I really feel like what you do every day is so invaluable, and I truly appreciate it. I think I turn it back to Beth Rubin at this point.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think Beth lost her connection. Thank you everyone for being here today. We have our next session next week at the same time. Let me just check if there was something else that Beth would have said. She was here.
Oh yes, I see next session is supporting students with disabilities in the remote classroom.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So thank you so much for everyone in the audience. Thank you to our discussants, to our presenters. And we'll see everyone for our next week's session on supporting students. Sorry, what was?
I noticed a few more things to mention, that there is a landing page for the series that will have resources that were mentioned tonight, as well as this video and previous sessions. And you can see the link below this window as well. And so remember to subscribe to the GSE YouTube channel and join us, yes, next week for session 4, supporting students with disabilities in the remote classroom. So thank you all for coming. Good night.